Like a lot of history nerds, I've been following the story of the Herculaneum papyri pretty closely. If you're unfamiliar, the Herculaneum papyri are about 1,800 papyrus scrolls discovered in a private library in Herculaneum, an ancient Roman town that was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The scrolls were actually discovered all the way back in 1750, but it's only been over the last few years that technology and techniques have emerged that allow the scrolls, which had been basically turned into rocks by volcanic ash, to actually be read. If all or most of the papyri are able to be deciphered, it will roughly double the amount of extant ancient papyri. So this work, if it's even a little successful, will repair vast swaths of the historical record. Obviously, the act of translating a game that was made within living memory, written in a language that's far from dead and that was probably never lost, isn't quite the same thing. But I bring up Herculaneum for two reasons. One, because, as per usual, I think it's a cool story and I wanted you to know about it if you didn't already. But for another, I'm interested in this idea of the act of translation as restoring history in some way, or at least presenting that history to a new audience. So in that spirit, this isn't just a recommendation video of recent fan translations that I like, though I do like all of them. In one way or another, each of these translations restores a stitch or two on the tapestry of video game history. I won't tell you where to find these pre-patched, because, as they say, loose lips sink ships, but I'll link to the patches themselves in the description. Also, these won't be especially deep dives into any of these games, since I don't want to spoil any of them too much, but most of them have been covered in greater depth elsewhere if you're interested. There's two things people need to know about me before becoming my friend. One, I'm an obnoxiously big fan of professional wrestling. And two, for most of my life, I've been a devoted acolyte of one Goichi Suda, more commonly known as Suda51. I picked up a copy of No More Heroes after a disastrous honor band tryout in middle school, and I've loved his games ever since. With that in mind, you can imagine what my reaction was when the story mode of Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, Suda's first ever creative work in a video game, was finally translated. People had talked about it for years, how Suda took the skeleton of a generic pro wrestling story and did genuinely radical things with it, in a way that presaged his later works of unique and provocative genius. So as soon as I could, I played it. Sadly, I didn't like it very much. I usually love Fire Pro, and I've put about 200 hours into the newest one on Steam, but this one just didn't feel very good to play. The timing mechanics, which make up the majority of Fire Pro gameplay, felt off here, and the pace of matches never felt quite right. It always seemed like matches either ended almost immediately or after what felt like forever, even if I was doing roughly the same thing each time. This came to a head for me later in the campaign when you start wrestling for one of the major promotions and each match has a 10-minute timer. If you don't pin them in that time, you lose. Since I could never figure out how to put people away that quickly consistently, I hit a wall there and stopped playing. Still, it's great that this important stepping stone in the career of someone I consider an all-time great is finally available in English. Rather amusingly, the patch by translator Boogle actually removes all modes other than the story mode, since to most people that's the only reason to go back to Special. Given that many other Fire Pro games, including from around that era, have been available in English for a while, that's probably fair. I realized while writing this that the next few entries can be understood in terms of expanding scale. What do I mean by that? Well, to start, I brought up a game important to the history of a single game director. Now here's one important to the history of an entire company. This is Metal Slader Glory, created by HAL Laboratory and originally released in 1991. You're almost certainly more familiar with HAL Labs as essentially Nintendo's elite developer hit squad, famous as the creators of Kirby as well as Smash. But originally they were an entirely independent outfit, and it was Metal Slader Glory that indirectly brought them under the auspices of Nintendo. Not because the game was a success, at least not financially, but because it did poorly enough relative to its massive budget and staggering 4-year development time that HAL risked bankruptcy, and Nintendo essentially stepped in to bail them out. The reality is maybe a bit more complicated, but you're here to learn about video game marginalia, not corporate acquisition marginalia. As for the game itself, it's an adventure, roughly in the style that would later be called a visual novel. Relatively few puzzles compared to, say, the graphical adventures of Sierra Online, and a greater focus on communicating a complex story through a heavy-for-the-time amount of text, though the game lacks the multiple endings that visual novels would become well known for. As for that story, here's the elevator pitch. In a future 8 years removed from a galaxy-spanning war where technology has advanced so far that giant mechs can be purchased by average civilians, A young man buys a mech for his business, only for it to communicate a message to him that the Earth is in grave danger. So, naturally, the rest of the game is about finding out what that means. Definitely boilerplate for sci-fi anime, but classic in a good way. And the aesthetic follows suit with a look I once jokingly dubbed OVA core. It looks like something that would have become a cult classic in the days of early anime dubs on VHS in the 90s, something like Megazone 23 or maybe Appleseed. And I absolutely love that style, so I love the way this game looks too. The footage I'm showing isn't actually from the original Famicom version, but rather from the Super Famicom Director's Cut version, which came out in 2000, the last official game for the console actually. Both are good, but I think the extra visual fidelity of the Super Famicom helps bring the best out of the excellent artwork, which really strained the processor power of the Famicom in the original version. Either way, if you have a fondness for classic sci-fi anime and you want to see what HAL Labs were doing before they made the greatest platformer mascot of all time, no, I did not stutter, give either version of Metal Slader Glory a try. Credit for the translation of both versions goes to FC and Chill, by the way. One more thing I feel compelled to bring up. I know I said I wouldn't say anything more about the corporate stuff, but this is important, I think. See, when Nintendo took HAL under their wing, there was a catch. And that catch was that the producer of Metal Slader Glory was to be put in charge of HAL Laboratory. And who was that producer? One Satoru Iwata. This game is actually how the future president of Nintendo first caught the eye of the company he would join in 2000 and lead from 2002 until his tragic death in 2015. He'll have been gone 10 years this July. Not much more to say other than rest in peace. From a game important to the history of a company, we move to a significant work in the history of an entire genre. Two genres, actually. This is Otogiriso. The first game in Spike Chunsoft's sound novel series, it's one of the first games that could unambiguously be called a visual novel in a modern sense, and it plays a lot more like one than Metal Slader Glory does. It's also a significant work in the larger and much more nebulous genre of horror games. Now, it's not the earliest horror game, nor the most celebrated one to be released before the genre really took off at the end of the 90s. A better candidate for that would be, say, Sweet Home, a 1989 game released by Capcom. I'm not covering that one because it seems to be quite a bit better known, and because its translation is far from recent, the first English patch for it coming out all the way back in 2000. But by all means, if you've never looked into Sweet Home before, I highly recommend it. As for Otogiriso, describing it in its most basic sense couldn't be any simpler. The game is narrated in the first-person perspective of a character you name yourself as he explores a seemingly abandoned mansion with his girlfriend after crashing their car on a rainy night. It's a spooky house story, of the kind that has been integral to horror for literal centuries. With a setup like that, the important thing is how it plays out. Thankfully, Otogiriso was clearly put together by people who know horror, particularly classic horror. It's a cliche to talk about how a horror story relies more on atmosphere than jump scares, but that is actually appropriate here. In fact, quite a few scares are only described in the text rather than shown. That could be seen as a choice made for budget and time reasons, and it probably is, but it also does genuinely serve to let your mind fill in the gaps in some places, in a way that's beneficial for an atmospheric gothic horror like this. It's far from perfect. Personally, I've yet to play a VN that doesn't drag its feet in places, and Otogiriso is no different, though its shorter length overall does help with that. And while the story isn't bad and held my interest throughout, it's not really anything special, especially when viewed against the games it influenced. At least in the route I saw. I'll confess that I didn't see every route the story can take, some of which are only accessible after clearing the game once, so there may be some super interesting stuff in some of those other routes. Then again, that would mean the game only gets super interesting after you've played it for several hours, so my point still stands. Then again, those shortcomings are probably part of the reason Otogiriso influenced so many games, from Silent Hill to the When They Cry series to Fate's Stay Night. The creators of those games could look at this one and see something compelling but imperfect, something that, therefore, they could add to. In that way, the works of art that start a movement are always flawed in some way in comparison to what comes after. They don't have much to build off of because they are what everyone else ends up building off of. All that said, if you're a horror fan and you have any interest in the history of the genre, which in my experience most horror fans do, then you owe it to yourself to give Otogiriso a look. As for patches, you've got two options. I use the more recent one by ButThouMust, but the translation from a year earlier by Tom, Flash PV, and DDS, which is hosted on translated.games, also looks quite good, so you're probably fine with whichever one you go with. This next one won't seem like an increase in scale, at least at first, but trust me. This one's really cool, at least for me. It's the 1998 Windows re-release of a 1995 DOS RPG called Sword and Fairy, made by the Taiwanese company Softstar Entertainment. I'm not going to talk super at length about this one, mostly because I've been enjoying it so much that I think I might make a full feature about it once I've finished it, but for now it'll suffice to say that it plays like a relatively standard for the time RPG, but with an aesthetic and story steeped in the grand tradition of martial arts fiction. If you're one of the people here who knows me personally, and in total I think that's like 4 of you at most, then you'll know why that makes for a game that I have trouble putting down. In all honesty though, I'm using Sword and Fairy in the context of this video to make a larger point. That point being, we would benefit from talking more about the game history of parts of the world not known as much for games as, say, the US and Japan. Let me explain by way of comparison to another medium. In film, while yes, a lot of people never leave Hollywood when it comes to learning about movies, I would say that the lion's share of critics, scholars, and general cinephiles would, if given the name of a country, be able to name a director or two from there most of the time. We're talking about Taiwan, right? Off the top of my head, Edward Yang, Hou Xiaoxian, Tsai Ming-liang. Hell, the biggest award in film was just won by an Iranian, that being director Jafar Panahi. Film is a consciously international art form. And games aren't quite there yet. I think they're on their way, though. Using Taiwan as an example again, you might be familiar with the excellent work of Red Candle, or a game I fell in love with a couple years back called The Legend of Tianding. Not just excellent games, but games steeped in the unique history and culture of the country in which they were made. Elsewhere, you have a game like Chia, a game made by French Canadians, but French Canadians who grew up on the islands of New Caledonia and based the game on their culture. In Brazil, there's the game Dandara, a Metroidvania inspired by the story of a real-life Afro-Brazilian warrior who led a slave revolt in the 17th century. Or if you really want to go for the jugular, there's 1979 Revolution, a game about the Iranian Revolution created by an Iranian artist in exile. And yes, I know there's Black Myth Wukong as well. I'm not bringing it up here for the simple reason that I assume you've already heard of it. My point is, games are on the cusp, I think, of becoming a genuinely worldwide medium. Maybe more so than film, since there are a lot of people who still don't like subtitles, but a translated game is usually fine for most players. And I think we should credit the games that helped make that possible, even in times and places where it probably didn't seem possible. When Sword and Fairy was made, Taiwan had just barely emerged from a 40-year military dictatorship. That's not the kind of world that tends to be fertile ground for young creatives, particularly those working in new media. And yet, the small group of developers at Softstar, who perhaps appropriately called themselves the Crazy Boys, made this game. And in doing so, not only did they almost single-handedly bolster an entire country's game industry, two really, because the game was also quite popular in mainland China, but they did so with a game that honestly is pretty damn fun. Anyway, credit for the translation goes to a group called PAL Fans, though good luck trying to find anything about them on the English parts of the internet. Depending on your perspective, this next entry will either be an expansion of scale or the complete opposite. That is to say, this is a translation that's important to me, and is in fact a big reason why I'm making this video in the first place. From a certain perspective, that's the largest possible scale, since solipsistically, I only know that I exist. Then again, that's probably unconvincing to those of you watching this who aren't me, but anyway. I can't quite remember when I first heard about Princess Crown, but it must have been well over a decade ago. I do remember that once I had seen it, I knew, for reasons that should be obvious seeing it in motion, that I had to play it somehow. Unfortunately, at the time, that wasn't possible, at least not without constant cross-referencing with the translation guide on GameFAQs. So over the years, every few months or so, I would check to see if anyone had taken up the task. At first, nothing. But after a few times doing this, a thread popped up on romhacking.net. I was excited, but I knew that these things took time, so I left it for a while. At some point, I learned that the people who made Princess Crown had formed their own company called Vanillaware and continued to make games that shared Princess Crown's impossibly gorgeous sprite work, so I played some of those. That assuaged my impatience quite a bit, so I stopped checking in on that thread, which was mostly dead by this point anyway. Then early this year, I played the newest Vanillaware game, Unicorn Overlord, which is probably my favorite of all of them. And after finishing it, I thought, what the hell, let's check back in on Princess Crown. And to my surprise, the translation had been picked back up and was actually pretty far along. So I waited until the patch reached version 1.0, and once it had, started playing it. So how is it? Well, let's talk about mechanics first. If you've played Vanillaware's other action RPGs like Odin Sphere or Muramasa the Demon Blade, there's a lot similar here. Navigation takes place along a flat 2D plane with various branching paths, and during random encounters as well as boss fights, the game switches to a discrete combat system separate from the rest of the game. In Muramasa and Odin Sphere, combat plays like a traditional 2D hack and slash, but here it's almost like an old school fighter, with slower movement and a heavy emphasis on meter management. Pretty much every action, including basic attacks and blocks, cost meter, so proper spacing and timing is paramount to avoid getting caught in a death spiral. It's a little hard to describe, and it takes getting used to, but it's not bad once you figure it out. As for the plot, it could fit on a napkin. Princess leaves castle to go on adventures. Film at 11. Like pretty much every Vanillaware game, the appeal is in seeing how that straightforward story plays out, and how the game world is brought to life by some of the best sprite art in game history. I often describe the Vanillaware aesthetic as looking like your most idealized memories of playing old games as a kid, and Princess Crown is no different, despite coming out in a time now pretty unambiguously understood to be retro. In short, the game looks really, really pretty. So with all that said, was Princess Crown worth the wait? Yeah, probably. It helps that I didn't exactly spend the whole time waiting with bated breath and just kinda checked back in incidentally every once in a while. Regardless, the game is fun. It's primitive in comparison to Odin Sphere or Muramasa, but I think that actually serves to make it so unlike those games that it still manages to have its own merits as something other than a dry run for those games. Also, the classic MIDI soundtrack is quite lovely. If you ever listen to the Unicorn Overlord 16-bit remix album, it sounds kind of like that, appropriately. If you're a fan of Vanillaware, you've probably already played Princess Crown or plan to play it, so I doubt I have to tell you to. But if this is your first time hearing about them, yeah, I'd still recommend you give Princess Crown a shot. As for the patch, the version currently available was started by Cyber Warrior X and Sam I Am all those years ago, then finished by EAD Master, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, earlier this year. Regrettably, that led to a little bit of drama, but it's not my place to litigate internet beef between people I don't know, so I'll just say that EAD Master's patch is fully available at the time of writing, and Cyber Warrior X and Sam I Am are working to complete a patch of their own if you're inclined to wait for that. Either way, credit is due to all three of them for their effort in making a game I've been fascinated by for years finally playable. This last one is a little different from the last four, both for not actually being finished yet and not really fitting into the whole expanding scale gimmick, but when I heard about this project, I knew I had to talk about it. So, Sega. The Chicago Cubs of video game companies. And for once, I'm not going to explain myself. You either feel that comparison viscerally or you don't. Anyway, the late 90s into the early 2000s were a uniquely chaotic time for the company, with the centerpiece of that chaos being the release of the Dreamcast, followed barely 2 years later by its cancellation. Segagaga, released in 2001, is an attempt to capture that chaos. It's a game where you take control of a Sega employee and try to bring the company back from the brink of total collapse. It's a biting satire, not only of Sega's place in the world at that time, but of the game industry as a whole. It's the sort of thing that you almost can't conceive of a major company making. But Sega did. And within a few months, the Dreamcast was completely discontinued worldwide. I've been fascinated by Segagaga for as long as I've been fascinated by Princess Crown, but I never got my hopes up. It seemed like something far too niche for even the inherently niche world of fan translation to ever take up the challenge. But thankfully, I was wrong. The translator Existence has been translating it for apparently the last few months and has already made really good progress. Their work looks fantastic thus far, and they seem to have a thoughtful understanding of how Segagaga remains relevant in the present day, so by all means show them some love. And if Existence happens to come across this video, I'd just like to say, Godspeed, I'm rooting for you. Thanks in advance for all your hard work. I hope I was able to convey the point I set out to with these examples. Each of the games I talked about today is in some way significant to the history of video games, and risked being accessible only to a single part of the world forever. But through the dedicated work of intelligent people, more players now have access to more of the history of the medium than they would have otherwise. In that way, fan translators are vital for helping form as complete a picture of this young art form as possible. Of course, as a nearly monolingual English speaker, I focused entirely on English translations. But this vital work of pro bono translation happens all over the world in probably every language that a computer is able to handle. And while I obviously don't know any of those people working outside my native language, they deserve appreciation as well. So to everybody who has put forth effort to help these often strange, often brilliant works of art travel across oceans, thank you for your dedication. I hope you consider this video a suitable expression of my gratitude and the gratitude of a lot of other people. And for everyone else, I hope you learned something interesting today. And above all, I hope you enjoyed the video. You know, maybe I should consider making that my outro from now on, but maybe not today. If there's a translation you think I should have talked about, by all means leave a comment. There were a few I avoided because they've been done to death, but I'm sure there are some I missed. Either way, see you next time.